At Investigate Midwest, we've been taking a close look at the connection between pesticide use and cancer. Cancer is a growing crisis across the nation's agricultural heartland, and studies have increasingly pointed to pesticides as a possible cause. Investigate Midwest recently published a map showing cancer and pesticide rates and the growing link. This week, a report from the advocacy group Food and Water Watch looked at similar data, including the rate of late stage cancer diagnosis in high pesticide use counties. Hi, I'm Ben Felder, editor in chief at Investigate Midwest, and I recently spoke with Amanda Starbuck, a research director for Food and Water Watch, about her organization's new report and why this is such a pivotal time for pesticide policy. So, Amanda, your organization recently compiled a major data analysis of pesticide rates and cancer rates. We were connected because Investigate Midwest recently published a similar data set. Both showed high rates of cancer and counties with the highest rates of pesticide use. You all have been tracking pesticide use and policy for years, and I want to get into the nuts and bolts of this data analysis that you did, but what was the genesis for wanting to compile this data set? What specifically made you want to look at glyphosates and mapping it by counties and comparing it to cancer rates?
Yeah, we really approached this from a few different angles. So we've been tracking and mapping factory farm density for many years now. So looking at county level livestock animals and kind of showing the hot spots in the US that are most burdened by factory farm pollution. But the other side of that is the feed production, right? Factory farms provide feed to their animals rather than grazing. Lots of corn and soybean and other crops feed into that. And so we wanted to kind of look at, what is that dual impact? Are there areas too that are really kind of suffering from excessive pesticide exposure sprayed on, types of commodity crops that you would see, for instance, in livestock feed and other uses. And so we decided that we'd look at that. And then also the cancer question, because the US in many parts is in a cancer crisis. There are states, especially in the Midwest, Minnesota, Iowa, that are among the highest for cancer rates. And while there's, obviously many different genetic and environmental factors that go into cancer development, one that's getting increased attention is chemical exposure. We wanted to see, was there any kind of, geographical overlap between where, the most spraying is happening in counties and then also like where cancer rates are. And because cancer is so complex, there's many different chemicals that are used in pesticides, also many different types of cancers. We decided to zero in on glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So that cancer has been specifically tied to glyphosate exposure. The evidence was so strong that it led the World Health Organization's cancer research arm to declare it a probable carcinogen about 10 years ago. So we figured that would be kind of a really interesting way to pinpoint, that specific chemical risk and that specific cancer.
Yeah, and the map that we did a few weeks ago, the map that you guys just released, I mean, it's pretty striking, like you said, when you overlay the cancer rates on the U.S. I mean, it kind of gives you a almost a near perfect image of where pesticides are used the most, or at least those crop producing regions. What I was particularly struck by, though, in your analysis was a look at late stage cancer
Okay.
diagnosis.
Mhm.
The top 20% of counties for late stage cancer diagnosis are largely in the upper Midwest, and many of the glyphosate rich counties like Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois.
Mhm.
Um, can talk about the importance of looking at late stage diagnosis and not just overall cancer rates.
Yeah, we didn't go into it expecting to, but that data was available. And so we figured it would be interesting just to see what it looked like. So late stage just means that the cancer was diagnosed at a later stage. Cancer is often divided into different stages. And that could happen for a number of reasons. It could be because people don't have cancer screenings or access to, primary care to kind of really kind of get, early intervention. And that could be maybe because it's a rural area that doesn't have necessarily access to hospitals and clinics. Could also be because of more aggressive types of cancer. So cancers that just really, are very aggressive and develop very quickly as well. And so we figured that was also an important, analysis to include in this.
Yeah, I mean, and that you talk the importance of cancer care, I mean, preventative care, early screenings. Like you just said, I mean, that can be a challenge in many rural communities,
Yeah.
whether it's because of, income levels or distance to facilities. Another thing that's interesting about when you talk about late stage diagnosis, and obviously one of the big things going on around this subject is litigation and the thousands of lawsuits against major agrochemical companies. It's really those late stage diagnosis where we're kind of seeing some of those lawsuits come from, right?
Yeah, that was another aspect too. This is coming at a time when, as you mentioned, there have been like nearly 100,000 lawsuits settled so far against Bayer, who is the manufacturer of the Roundup herbicide. Used to be Monsanto. They purchased Monsanto in about 2018. And you're right. A lot of the cases, the strongest cases that are able to make it into litigation, are the ones that are more aggressive, late stage ones. And so we figured that was also important to include for that reason.
Yeah. This is such a pivotal moment for pesticide and agrochemical policy. It seems like there's just a lot of big issues right now, and what this front looks like in a few years, we're still is still to be determined. I mean, kind of why is this such a pivotal moment right now for this topic?
Yeah, in part because of all the litigation that's been happening for the last several years, and the pesticide industry has really gone from being defensive to on the offensive, right? So they've already paid out. Bayer, I think, has paid out around 11 billion in damages to cancer victims, and is trying to maybe settle an additional 11 billion. But at the same time, is trying to pass legislation both at the state and at the federal level to preempt people bringing these cases forward. So they're called pesticide preemption. We call them the cancer gag.
Mm.
So there have been, about 8 in different state legislatures attempts to basically prevent individuals from bringing forth litigation for harms that are caused after using a product. And those, individuals are assuming that this product caused their harms. It would basically prevent people from doing that as long as those products are labeled according to EPA standards. But EPA labels oftentimes focus on things like acute risks, like what happens if you get a dermal exposure, if you drink it, sometimes don't really address those larger long-term chronic risks, including cancer. So really, it's just an attempt to prevent more of these lawsuits from coming forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why when I first saw your map, I kind of immediately looked at North Dakota, one of 2 states that has
Mhm.
passed these shield laws, and there is a cluster of counties that rate high, not just for cancer rates, but late stage cancer rates that are also high pesticide use counties, and, that would be an example of it. I mean, we're still seeing how these new laws in the North Dakota and Georgia will
Mhm.
play out, but that was kind of the immediate thing I thought of was just kind of those people
Yeah.
that may not have that litigation relief, in a cluster like that.
Yeah, that was my thought too. That's my home state. So it's definitely where my eyes went to on the map. And there's a lot of data missing. I mean, that's part of the problem is that a lot of counties aren't reporting publicly their cancer rates because, maybe it's a small population county and they don't want to have any kind of individual, kind of information revealed. And so there's a lot of data withheld from the public. So in a place like North Dakota, we don't know the full picture. There are many, many counties that did not provide any data on their cancer incidence rates, so we couldn't include them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm curious, what specific policies would you like to see when we talk about this moment of, I mean, obviously your organization is against these bills at the state level and what's being discussed at the federal level, but,
Mhm.
instead of beyond just a rejection of these bills, I'm curious, what do you think, what policies do you feel like lawmakers need to be paying attention to kind of respond to this cancer crisis?
Yeah, we're watching the development of a couple bills at the federal level. So, this isn't just a attempt at states. There have been attempts to, kind of pass federal legislation, whether that's through, shoehorning preemption into like the farm bill or appropriations bills and stuff. And so we also need to be on the offensive, not just fighting those attempts, but also making sure we strengthen our pesticide regulations and the ability of people to bring these cases forward. So one of the bills out there, Senator Cory Booker has introduced the Pesticide Injury Accountability Act. And this would ensure that pesticide manufacturers are held accountable for the harms caused by their products. It would amend federal pesticide legislation to create a right of action, basically a direct pathway for people to bring these suits to courts, to federal courts. And so we really see this bill as a way to, ensure that farmers, farm workers, their families, community members who are exposed to these pesticides have a clear legal pathway to seek compensation. So
Yeah.
that's just one. There's another bill that's moving in the House called the No Immunity for Glyphosate Act, and this would specifically respond to this issue of immunity for glyphosate. It's in response to a recent executive order by the Trump administration to shore up glyphosate production, basically saying that we need it for food security, ignoring the fact that most of the glyphosate is sprayed on crops that go to things like animal feed and ethanol. And so this one would basically prevent companies from seeking this pesticide immunity. And again, really provide an avenue for ensuring that people who are victims of cancer have the ability to bring these cases forward to federal court.
Yeah. And finally, there are multiple scientific studies that have claimed a link between pesticides and cancer. And as you said earlier, I mean, cancer is a complex
Mhm.
disease and a lot of different factors. But there's been some compelling studies that have kind of showed that link. But those are often like scientific studies and kind of wonky. And you and I have maybe read it, but I'm curious, like, why do you think the map that you guys created and why do you think that's so striking? I mean, what do you hope the response is from the public in seeing this?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a lot of really great evidence out there, so we can kind of look at it from different angles. We have like laboratory evidence. Scientists will look in a laboratory and see, does a chemical damage the DNA of an animal cell or a human cell? That could be a precursor for cancer. There's studies on lab animals looking for tumors among groups exposed to things like Roundup or glyphosate, which is the active ingredient. And those have all really shown. There's been a ton of evidence showing like that. Yes, it seems like glyphosate could be, potentially causing cancer. You have those larger epidemiological studies, so where they follow, like farming communities over the course of 15, 20 years, see what their chemical exposure is. Do they have high rates of cancer? These are all very expensive and very difficult to do. And also, like you said, kind of difficult for the average person who's not immersed in this science on a daily basis to understand. So ours has really taken a very different step towards it, looking for that geographical overlay, right? In a way that's very visual and very easy to look at and understand. It's not a scientific study, it's a geographical study. And so we're just looking, is there any kind of geographical overlay between where glyphosate is sprayed and the people getting cancer? And the map, I think, is a way to kind of visibly show that, one study ever proves any of this, but really it's a weight of evidence. And I think the more evidence we have out there, the stronger case that can be made that we really need to be scrutinizing glyphosate in every pesticide that we use.
Yeah,
And
and
it's really, hopefully a tool for individuals in these cancer hotspots, as we call them, the areas that have the highest rates of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, to really bring to their leaders and say, what are you doing about this? How are you protecting us?
yeah, that's why exactly right. I think what's so useful about these maps is the interactive feature and to be able to look up that data on both cancer and pesticide use in your own communities. And so definitely hope people will do that. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for the work and thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to me.